"Your time is up, old woman. Nobody on this block even knows your name anymore. You're nobody here now." Carl Brandt said it standing on her own front porch, the porch she had swept every single morning for 50 years. And he said it loud, so the men in hard hats behind him could hear, so the whole street could hear. He held a folded white eviction notice out toward her in 2 manicured fingers, the way you hold something dirty. And he wore the tight little smile of a man who has already won and just wants to enjoy saying so out loud. Miss Ruthie did not take the paper. 78 years old, in her house dress and her slippers, one hand resting on the frame of the door she had walked through 10,000 times. She looked at the young developer the way you look at weather, something loud and temporary that would pass. What Carl Brandt did not know, what not one person standing on that street that morning understood, was that the nobody he was throwing out of her house had spent 50 years quietly raising half the people who mattered in that city. And the phone number she was about to dial was about to bring every last one of them home. Before this developer finds out exactly who is about to walk onto that porch, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. Please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and let's dive back into the story. Her name was Ruth Mae Jackson, and everybody who had ever been a child on that block called her Miss Ruthie. And she had lived in that little house on the corner since 1976. It was a small house, and it had never been anything but small. 2 bedrooms, a front room, and a kitchen that was somehow bigger than all the rest of it put together, not in square feet, but in the way that mattered. It sat on the corner of a street that had been, for half a century, the kind of working neighborhood that the city forgot about, except when it wanted something. The paint on Miss Ruthie's house was a soft blue that she touched up herself every couple of springs, up on a stepladder she had no business being on at her age, waving off anybody who tried to take the brush. There was a porch swing that had held more crying teenagers than she could count. There were 2 folding chairs by the door, where, on summer evenings, she sat and watched the street and knew, by name, every single soul who walked past. And that morning, that soft blue house with the porch swing was the last lived-in house on the entire block. Miss Ruthie had watched the street empty out over 2 years, house by house, like lights going off down a hallway. She knew exactly what was happening, and she knew exactly who was doing it. And she had decided, somewhere deep in her steady old heart, that she was not going to be one more light going out. So, when the letters came, she did not panic. When the men in the SUV started parking out front and taking photographs of her house, she brought them lemonade and watched them not know what to do with it. And now that the man himself was standing on her porch telling her she was nobody, she did not cry, and she did not argue, and she did not beg. She just looked at him for a long, quiet moment, the way she used to look at a child who was working up to a lie. "You can leave that on the step," she told him at last, and her voice was perfectly steady. "I've got a call to make." Carl Brandt blinked. That was not the reaction he was used to. He was used to fear, or tears, or shouting. He had built a whole career on those reactions, on the way frightened people sign things they shouldn't, just to make the frightening man go away. He was not used to an old woman in slippers looking at him like he was a slow-moving storm and then turning her back on him. "It's a formal notice," he said, and some of the smoothness had gone out of it. 30 days. The bank holds the paper. I don't think you understand what's happening here." "Oh, I understand exactly what's happening here," Miss Ruthie said, without turning around. "I've understood it longer than you have, baby." And she opened her screen door, and she stepped inside, and she let it fall shut softly behind her. And she walked through her little house, past the front room, past the porch swing, creaking empty in the breeze, toward the kitchen and the one thing in that house that mattered more than the deed or the paint or the porch. She walked past the old painted doorframe between the kitchen and the back hall, the doorframe with its 50 years of secrets carved into the wood in pencil, though Carl Brandt out on the porch could not have begun to guess what was written there. On the kitchen wall hung a telephone, an actual rotary telephone, cream-colored, The cord stretched and curled from decades of being carried back and forth across that kitchen while she talked. It had hung there since before Carl Brandt was born. Half the important conversations of half the lives on that block had happened on that phone, and taped to the wall beside it, yellowed and soft at the edges, was a list of names and numbers in Miss Ruthie's careful hand. She did not need the list. She knew the number she wanted by heart. But she touched the list anyway, the way you touch something for luck, and her finger moved down past the names, past doctors and lawyers and police officers and builders who had once been hungry children at her table, and stopped on the first name, the one she had decided, lying awake the night before, to call first. She lifted the heavy receiver and held it to her ear, and the old dial tone hummed, the same hum it had hummed for 50 years. And with one careful finger, slowly, she began to dial. Out on the porch, Carl Brandt stood holding his notice, looking at the closed screen door, feeling, for the first time in this whole easy, profitable job, a small, unfamiliar flicker of something he could not name. He had no idea that the something was the beginning of the worst mistake of his life. To understand who Miss Ruthie was, you have to stand in that kitchen and look at the doorframe. It was nothing much to look at if you didn't know. Just the painted wooden frame of the doorway between the kitchen and the little back hall, the paint worn down to bare wood in places from 50 years of hands and shoulders. But if you looked closely, you saw the marks, pencil lines, dozens and dozens of them, climbing up the frame from knee height to well over 6 feet. And beside each line, in Miss Ruthie's careful hand, a name and a date. Marcus, age 7. Andre, age 9, Tanya, age 6, little Greg, age 10, Deshawn, Keisha, Robert, twins, May and May, same height, same day. Some names appeared once. Some climbed that doorframe year after year, line over line, a whole childhood measured in pencil on a kitchen door. A child who had come back again and again to be fed and measured and loved until the lines ran out the top of the frame because the child had finally grown up and gone out into the world. 50 years of children. That is what was written on that doorframe. Every kid who had ever stood with their heels against that wood, while Miss Ruthie balanced a book flat on their head and made a careful mark and told them, every single time, the same thing. Look at you. Look how you're growing. You are going to be somebody. You hear me? Somebody. She said it to every one of them. The hungry ones and the scared ones, and the ones the world had already decided about at 8 years old. You are going to be somebody. And the remarkable thing, the thing this whole story turns on, is that she had been right almost every single time, because a child who is told, by somebody who truly means it, that they are going to be somebody, very often becomes exactly that. She had not set out to raise a neighborhood. Nobody does. It started the way it always starts, with one cold child on a porch. The first name at the bottom of that doorframe was so old and so low that you had to crouch to read it, and the date beside it was from the 1970s. And the child it belonged to was a grandmother herself now. Ruth Mae had taken that first one in on a winter afternoon because the child was sitting on a stoop in a thin coat with nowhere to go, and Ruth Mae could no more have walked past that than she could have stopped her own heart. She fed the child, and the child told another child, and that was that. The door, once opened, never really closed again for 50 years. She never had money. She cleaned other people's houses for 30 years, big houses across town, where she was invisible the way working women are invisible, where the families whose floors she scrubbed never once thought to ask what she did when she went home. What she did when she went home was raise their city's future, though none of them knew it. Later, she drew a pension so small it embarrassed the young man at the bank when he read the number out loud. And out of that nothing, she gave away more than most rich people give out of their plenty. She did not think of it as charity, and she would have been embarrassed, even a little angry, to hear it called that. She thought of them as hers. Every child who ate at her table, or slept on her couch, or got measured against that doorframe was, in the only way Ruth Mae ever cared about, her own child. And she had been quietly, faithfully, namelessly building a family for half a century, one hungry kid at a time. In the bedroom closet, on the shelf above her one good coat, there was a tin box, a cookie tin really, dented, the painted lid long since worn down to bare metal. And inside that box was the other half of the doorframe story. Because Ruth Mae kept things, she kept every letter any of her children had ever sent her. She kept the graduation programs and the wedding invitations and the birth announcements of babies belonging to babies she had once measured against that wood. She kept newspaper clippings cut out carefully and folded, a local doctor opening a free clinic, a young lawyer winning a case for a family about to be put out of their home. And on the back of each clipping, in pencil, she had written the child's name and the age they'd been when they first sat at her table. The tin box was full to the lid. It was, though she never would have used the word, an archive, a record of what one woman with no money and no name and no children of her own had managed to build out of a warm kitchen and the simple refusal to look away. The neighbors knew, the old ones. They knew that when their grandchild went missing, Miss Ruthie's kitchen was the first place to look, and that the child would be found there, calm and fed and doing homework at her table. They knew the casseroles that appeared on a porch when somebody got sick, left by no one, never explained. They knew Miss Ruthie had never once in 50 years called the police on a neighborhood child, but had walked more than a few of them home by the ear, and that being walked home by Miss Ruthie was somehow both worse than an arrest and better than a hug. She was the memory of the block. She was its conscience and its kitchen and its keeper, the fixed point the whole street turned around. She was about to find out, the hard way, whether 50 years of that kind of love adds up to anything at all when a man with lawyers decides your time is up, or whether it just evaporates, the way the world is always so quick to assume the quiet woman's life will. She did not know the answer yet, dialing that phone, but she was about to. But Carl Brandt did not see any of that when he looked at her. Carl Brandt saw a parcel of land with a stubborn obstacle standing on it in slippers. Carl was 45, and he had made a great deal of money doing exactly one thing, buying up old neighborhoods cheap, hollowing them out, and selling what was left to people who would never before have set foot on that street. He had a word for it that he used at dinner parties, revitalization, and he had a real, almost artistic talent for the part of the work that nobody puts in the brochure, the part that involved making human beings disappear from the places they had lived their whole lives, quietly, legally, and on schedule. He understood pressure the way a plumber understands water. He knew that old people on fixed incomes could be squeezed out without anyone ever raising a voice. A property tax reassessment here, a sudden citation for a code violation there, a fee that appeared out of nowhere with a due date that fell just a little too soon. He knew that a block, once you owned a few houses on it, began to tip on its own, and that fear did most of the remaining work for free. Put plywood over the windows of 3 empty houses and the people in the 4th start lying awake. Let a corner go dark and weedy, and the families who stayed begin, on their own, to call him, frightened, exhausted, ready to take less than the place was worth just to be done with it. Carl rarely had to be the villain out loud. The machine he had built was the villain, and a machine has no face to spit at. He had taken almost the whole of Miss Ruthie's block exactly that way, over 2 patient years. The Hendersons on the far end, gone. The Pearson house, and there is a whole story in the Pearson house, which you will hear in a moment. Gone, sold for a song after a tangle of liens that Carl's people somehow knew about, before the Pearsons themselves did. One by one, the windows had gone dark down that street, and the plywood had gone up, and the living block where children had been raised for half a century had been emptied into a row of waiting houses, waiting for the bulldozers Carl had already scheduled. All of it, end to end, except the soft blue house on the corner, where one old woman would not sell, would not scare, and would not go. And so, Carl had moved, with Miss Ruthie, from squeezing to shoving. The technical pressure had not worked on her. She paid her tiny taxes on time. She fixed her own code violations before the ink dried on the notice. She brought his surveyors lemonade and asked after their children by name until they couldn't look her in the eye. So he had reached for something heavier. There is always something heavier for a man like Carl, and he had found it. A way to get a mortgage onto a house that had been owned free and clear for decades. A way to manufacture a default. A way to put the bank's machinery in motion and produce, on a Tuesday morning, on her own porch, a notice of eviction with 30 days on it and the apparent full weight of the law behind every word. He had a partner in it, of a sort. The thin man in the gray suit standing behind him on the porch was Kevin Daly, 38, a manager at the bank that held the freshly minted paper on Miss Ruthie's house. Kevin was not cruel the way Carl was cruel. Kevin was something quieter and, in its way, more common. A man who had decided, long ago, that the things he did for money were not really his to answer for, because he was only following the policy. He had a sympathetic voice he had practiced until it almost passed for the real thing, and he used it now, to nobody, to a closed screen door. I understand this is difficult, but the bank's position is trailing off into the morning air. Some small, walled-off part of Kevin Daly knew the difference between the rules and what was right, and knew he had spent his whole career standing on the wrong side of that line and calling it his job. But the bonus was good. Carl Brandt's business was very good. So Kevin stood on an old woman's porch with his leather folder and told himself, the way he always did, that none of this was really up to him. Carl checked his expensive watch and frowned at the closed door. He had a schedule. He had financing that depended on the schedule. He had investors who had been promised a cleared block by spring. And one slipper-wearing obstacle was the only thing between him and the part of the job he actually enjoyed, which was watching the bulldozers turn somebody's whole life into a vacant lot full of opportunity. He had assumed this last one would be the easiest of all. A widow with no money, no lawyer, and, as far as he could tell from the county records, no living family of any kind. The most alone person on the most empty street in the city. That was the assumption the entire scheme rested on, that she was alone. Carl had done his homework the way he always did, pulling the records, checking for heirs, for relatives, for anyone who might make noise. And he had found a woman with no husband, no children, no one. On paper, Ruth Mae Jackson was as isolated as a human being could be. On paper, there was no one to call. Carl Brandt had never once thought to ask the question that mattered, because it was not the kind of question that shows up in county records. He had asked who was related to her. He had never asked who she had raised. And inside the soft blue house, the old rotary phone had stopped ringing because somewhere across the city, in a glass office on the 14th floor, a man in a good suit had just seen a number he hadn't seen in months light up his phone and had felt his whole chest go tight, and had answered it on the first ring. Before we follow that phone call, you need to understand the Pearsons, because the Pearsons were the warning, and nobody on that block had been able to stop what happened to them. Walter and Loretta Pearson had lived 4 doors down from Miss Ruthie for 40 years. Walter had worked at the steel plant until it closed, and then driven a delivery truck until his knees gave out. And Loretta had raised 3 children in that house and buried one of them from it, the way too many families on that street had buried a child. The 2 of them had paid down their mortgage $1 slow dollar at a time across 4 decades, until at last the house was fully, finally, completely theirs. No bank, no lien, no landlord, paid off, and free. It was supposed to be the thing they left behind. It was supposed to be the proof that they had been here, that they had worked and stayed and built something that would outlast them and pass to their children. For people who had started with nothing, that paid-off house was not just a building. It was the whole answer to the question of whether their lives had added up to anything. Carl Brandt took it from them in about 8 months. It started, the way it always started, with a letter. A lien nobody had ever heard of, some decades-old assessment, suddenly come due, with interest and penalties that had quietly compounded into a number the Pearsons could not begin to pay. Then came more letters, and fees on top of fees, and a very helpful man who appeared as if by magic to explain that Given their unfortunate situation, the smartest thing, really the only sensible thing, was to sell quickly and quietly before it got any worse. And it just so happened, the helpful man said, that he knew a buyer who would take the property as is and spare them the whole ugly process. The Pearsons, frightened and exhausted and unable to make sense of paper that seemed designed not to be understood, sold the house they had owned outright for a fraction of what it was worth, and signed where the helpful man pointed, and told themselves they had been lucky to get out from under it. They moved into a cramped apartment across town, near no one they knew, up a flight of stairs that Walter's knees could barely manage, and Walter Pearson, who had been a strong, proud, upright man his entire life, was dead inside the year. Loretta would tell anyone who asked, and for a long time, nobody asked, that the move was what killed him, that he simply gave up once the house was gone, once the thing his whole life had added up to had been signed away to a stranger for pennies. "You can dig an old tree up out of the ground if you decide to," she said once, dry-eyed, past crying. "But you'd best not act surprised when it dies in the new hole." Miss Ruthie had watched all of it. She had carried casseroles up that unfamiliar flight of stairs. She had sat with Loretta and held her hand at Walter's funeral in a church across town full of people who didn't know him, and she had understood, with a cold and total clarity, exactly what had been done, and that it had not been bad luck, and it had not been the market, and it had not been God's will. It had been a man with a system, working his way down her street, and she had known, sitting in that funeral pew, that she was somewhere on his list. She was not naive. She had lived 78 years on the hard end of the world, and she knew what a wolf looked like even when it wore a good suit and called itself revitalization. What she had understood, watching the Pearsons go under, was that the danger was not really the lien or the fee or the helpful man. The danger was being alone with it. The Pearsons had faced the machine the way most people face it, by themselves, in the dark, with paper they couldn't read and no one to call who knew how to read it. And alone, against that machine, almost nobody wins. But here's the thing the Pearsons did not have, that Miss Ruthie did. The Pearsons, for all their decency, had spent their lives keeping mostly to themselves, raising their own, minding their own business, which is no sin, but it meant that when the wolf came, there were only the two of them to stand against it. Miss Ruthie had spent her 50 years doing the opposite. She had spent 50 years making sure she was never really alone, though she had never once thought of it that way, though she had only ever thought she was feeding hungry children. She had been, without ever planning it, building the one thing that could stand against a man like Carl Brandt. Not money, not lawyers, not paper, people. A whole city's worth of people who owed her everything and had been waiting their entire adult lives, without quite knowing it, for the chance to pay it back. So, when the first letters had come for her, months before that morning on the porch, Miss Ruthie had not done what the Pearsons did. She had not faced it alone in the dark. She had gone to her closet and taken down the dented tin box, and sat on the edge of her bed, and begun to go through it. The letters, the clippings, the announcements, the list of names and numbers taped inside the lid. She had read the whole archive of her life, one piece at a time, late into the night. And she had thought, looking at all of it, not me. They got Walter and Loretta because Walter and Loretta were alone. They are not going to get me because I am not. She just had to wait until the man showed his whole hand. And that Tuesday morning, standing on her porch, calling her nobody, Carl Brandt finally had. Let me tell you who her children were, because the viewer needs to know, even though Carl Brandt never bothered to, exactly who was about to start arriving on that empty street. There was Marcus. Dr. Marcus Bell, 40 years old now, who ran an emergency department and a free clinic on the city's east side, the kind of doctor who stays past the end of his shift, because the waiting room is still full of people nobody else will see. But in 1993, Marcus had been a 7-year-old boy who came to school with no coat and a flinch in him that the teachers learned not to ask about. Miss Ruthie found him, she always found them, sitting on her low porch wall one freezing afternoon because it was warmer than going home. She brought him inside and fed him, and then she fed him most days for the next 10 years. She bought him his first real winter coat with money she did not have. She sat across the kitchen table from him every night through high school and made him do the homework when he wanted to quit. And the day the letter came that said he'd gotten into college, Marcus ran the 4 blocks to her house to read it out loud to her before he read it to anyone else alive, including his own mother. Marcus Bell became a doctor because a woman who scrubbed other people's floors decided, when he was 7 and freezing, that he was going to be somebody. Her photograph hung on the wall of his office. He had never once missed calling her on a Sunday. There was Andre. Andre Reed, 35, a lawyer now, sharp, relentless, very good, who happened to specialize in housing law and tenants' rights, which was not an accident, which was the least accidental thing in the world. Andre had been 9 when his mother went away to prison, and he had bounced between relatives who didn't want him until he landed, half feral and furious, on Miss Ruthie's block. She took him in. She fed him, and she refused, with a patience that bordered on the supernatural, to give up on an angry little boy that every other adult in his life had already filed away as a lost cause. She was the one who told him, in that kitchen, that his anger wasn't a flaw, that it was just love that hadn't found anywhere to go yet, and that he could either let it burn his own life to the ground or learn to aim it at things that deserve burning. Andre aimed it at the law. He had spent 10 years using it to fight people who did to poor families precisely what was being done, at that very moment, to the woman who raised him. He just didn't know yet that the latest case had her name on it. There was Tanya, Detective Tanya Hughes, 33, who had been a tiny 6-year-old hiding in Miss Ruthie's kitchen on more than one night when things at her own house got loud and dangerous, and a small girl needed a safe place with a locked door and a warm light, and a woman who would sit up with her until it passed. Tanya had become the kind of police officer who remembers what it is to be small and frightened in your own home, which made her, her colleagues said, the best they had at the cases nobody else could stomach. There was Greg Carter, 50 now, a building contractor and a licensed city inspector who at 10 years old had been the terror of the block. A wild kid Miss Ruthie had personally caught throwing rocks at the streetlights, and somehow, over years of feeding him and putting him to work, fixing things instead of breaking them, had turned into a man who built. And there were dozens more, a school teacher, a nurse, a pastor, a city councilman's chief of staff, a woman who ran the very community foundation that quietly funded half the good that happened in that part of town. Doctors, lawyers, police, builders, teachers, scattered now all across the city, living their grown and busy and important lives. And almost none of them knew yet that the woman who had made all of those lives possible was standing in her doorway that morning, being called a nobody by a man who wanted to bulldoze her home. That is the thing about this story that you, watching, get to hold the whole time. The thing Carl Brandt did not have the imagination to suspect. He looked at the records and saw a woman with no one. You know better. You know that the soft blue house on the corner was the most connected address in the entire city, wired by 50 years of pencil marks on a doorframe to 100 lives that would stop dead the instant the call came. He thought he had cornered the loneliest woman on the block. He had, in fact, walked up onto the porch of the best defended house in town and announced his name. He just hadn't found out yet. The reason all of them could be reached so fast, the reason the chain could light up across a whole city in a single morning, was that tin box in the closet and the list of numbers taped inside its lid, and the simple, stubborn fact that Miss Ruthie had never let a single one of them drift all the way out of her life. People moved away. She kept the new number. People got busy. She called anyway, on birthdays, on the anniversaries of hard days she remembered when no one else did. She was the keeper of the thread, all 50 years of it, and she had kept it taut, so that when the morning finally came that she needed them, the morning she had quietly prepared for ever since Walter Pearson's funeral, Every number still worked, and every person on the other end of every number would know her voice the instant they heard it, and not one of them would hesitate, not for a second, when she said the words she was about to say. She had dialed Andre first, and Andre had answered on the first ring. "Andre, baby," she said when he picked up. "I'm sorry to bother you at your work." He knew instantly that something was wrong, because Miss Ruthie's voice was the steadiest thing he had ever known in his life, and it was not quite steady now. "You're not bothering me," he said, already sitting up straight at his desk. "Tell me what's wrong, right now." "There's a man on my porch," she said. "From a developer. Says the bank took the house. Says I've got 30 days. A pause. Says I'm nobody around here anymore. Says nobody even knows my name. And in his glass office on the 14th floor, Andre Reed felt the exact thing she had taught him to recognize when he was a furious 9-year-old at her kitchen table. The cold, still, focused thing that was not rage but rage's older and far more dangerous cousin. The thing she had told him to find and to use instead of letting the heat run him. "Miss Ruthie," he said, already standing, already reaching for his keys. "Listen to me carefully. Do not sign one single thing. Do not take anything out of that man's hand if you can help it. I am leaving this office right now, and I'm going to make some phone calls on the way." He stopped at his door. "Whatever he told you out there, you are not nobody. By the end of this week, that man is going to wish he had never heard the name Ruth Mae Jackson. Do you hear me?" There was a small silence on the line, and then she said the thing that nearly broke him. "I hear you, baby. I raised you. Of course I believe you." Out on the porch, none of that had reached Carl Brandt yet. He could not hear the phone call. He could not see the chain beginning to light up across the city. He only saw that the old woman had gone back inside and not come out, and it irritated him, the way a small, unexpected delay irritates a man with a tight schedule and bulldozers on the calendar. So, when Miss Ruthie finally came back out onto her porch a few minutes later, calm, composed, the receiver set back on its hook inside, Carl decided to finish the job he had come to do, and to finish it the way he liked to finish things, out loud, in front of an audience, so it would stick. "I'm glad you're back," he said, and the smile returned, sharper now. "Let me make this very simple for you, because I don't think it's getting through. This block is mine, every house on it. You're the last one, and you're holding up a project that's bigger than you can imagine, and frankly, it's a little sad. Look around." He gestured at the empty street, the plywood, the silence. "Nobody's here anymore. Your friends are gone. Your time is gone. Whatever you used to be on this block, 50 years ago, whenever, that's over. You're an old woman in a house that doesn't belong to you anymore, and your time is up. So, do yourself a favor. Pack your things, take the relocation money I'm being generous enough to offer, and go quietly. Because one way or another, this house is coming down." It was as cruel a thing as a person can say to another person, and he said it in the open air, on her own swept porch, loud enough for the empty street to hear, the way you crush something, not because you have to, but because you can. And Miss Ruthie did not flinch. She stood at the top of her own steps, small and straight, her hands folded in front of her house dress, and she looked at Carl Brandt with an expression that was almost, and this was the part that unsettled him, almost gentle. The look of a woman who has buried a husband in 100 heartbreaks and outlasted every storm the world ever sent at her, regarding a man who thinks a tight schedule and a stack of paper make him powerful. She let him finish. She let the ugly words hang there in the morning air and die. And then she said, very quietly, the only answer she gave him, "Son, you keep saying my time is up." She tilted her head. "You might want to sit down and have some patience, because I believe my company's about to arrive." Carl had no idea what she meant. He gave a short, irritated laugh, checked his watch again, and told Kevin Daly they had come back with the lockout crew that week. He did not understand that he had just been warned, fairly, plainly, the way she warned everyone before the consequences came, and that, like most men who are sure of themselves, he had heard the warning as the meaningless talk of someone already beaten. Now you, watching this, before the company arrives, I want you to do one thing for me. Somewhere in your life, there was probably a Miss Ruthie. Somebody who fed you when you were hungry in a way that had nothing to do with food. Somebody who looked at you when you were small and scared and told you that you were going to be somebody before there was one scrap of evidence that it was true. If that person crossed your mind just now, tell me their name in the comments, right now. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't yet, and turn the bell on, because the cars are already starting their engines all across this city, and you are not going to want to miss who pulls up to that porch first. Because they were coming. Andre had hung up and made good on his promise inside of 60 seconds. He called Marcus. Marcus, in scrubs between patients, went very quiet and then said only, "Where? Tell me where." Marcus called Tanya. Tanya called Greg. And down the thread it ran, name to name to name, the words landing in each of their lives like a struck match. They're taking Miss Ruthie's house. A doctor stepped out of a department meeting in mid-sentence. A detective signed off her shift 2 hours early. A contractor left a job site with the engine still running. 50 years of children, scattered across a whole city, all turned at once toward a single soft blue house on a single empty corner, and started to drive. Here is what it looks like when a thing one woman built quietly over 50 years comes back to life all at once. It looked like a phone buzzing on a surgical unit counter, and a doctor reading 3 words and handing his clipboard to a colleague without a word of explanation. It looked like a detective closing a folder, telling her partner, "Family thing, I have to go," and meaning it more completely than her partner could have guessed. It looked like a contractor named Greg standing on a half-framed roof, reading a text and climbing straight back down the ladder. It looked like a school teacher arranging a substitute mid-morning, a pastor canceling an afternoon of appointments, a foundation director walking out of a board meeting with a murmured apology. All over the city, in the space of a few hours, busy and accomplished grown people stopped their important lives in the middle of a sentence, because the woman who had made those lives possible needed them, and there was not one of them who would not have crawled across broken glass to get to her. They did not all know each other. That was the strange and beautiful thing. Some of them had overlapped at that kitchen table as children and were lifelong friends. Others had come through years apart and had never met, and only knew vaguely that there had been others, that Miss Ruthie's was the kind of place that had always had others. But the thread connected them anyway because it ran through her. And as the calls went out that morning, people who had never spoken found themselves on the phone together, 2 strangers discovering in real time that they were, in every way that counted, brother and sister, that they had been raised at the same table, measured against the same doorframe, told the same sentence by the same woman. You are going to be somebody. They compared the sentence on the phone, half laughing, half crying, and then they got in their cars. By that evening, Andre had a list going on a legal pad. Who could come, who was coming tomorrow. The number kept climbing, 20, 30, more on the way from out of town. He sat in his office long after dark, the city lights below him, working 2 phones at once, and somewhere in the middle of it, he had to stop and put his head down on his desk for a minute, because the size of it had caught up with him. The sheer size of what one old woman with no money and no name had quietly built, now revealing itself in real time as a small army of doctors and lawyers and police and builders, all converging on one little house. He thought about being 9 years old at that table, furious at the whole world, and a woman telling him his anger was just love with nowhere to go. He picked the phone back up. But Carl Brandt was not finished either, and Carl knew something Andre's growing army did not yet fully grasp, that the law, on paper, was on Carl's side, and that the simplest way to win was not to argue the law, but to get the old woman out of the house before anyone could argue anything at all. Possession, Carl liked to say, is 9/10 of everything. Once the locks were changed and the plywood was up, once she was scattered across town like the Pearsons, the fight would drain out of it. A house you have already been evicted from is a far harder thing to fight for than a house you are still standing inside. So even as the cars pointed toward the block, Carl was on his own phone, calling in a favor, moving the lockout up. He decided this stubborn old woman would be out by the weekend, paper perfect or not. And so, 2 days later, a second notice appeared. This one taped to Miss Ruthie's own front door, with a date on it and a single word in heavy black letters: lockout. She found it in the morning, going out to sweep the porch the way she had swept it for 50 years. She stood and looked at it for a long time, the broom in her hand, the empty plywood street stretching away on both sides. And for the first time in this whole story, even Miss Ruthie, who had more steel in her spine than the whole rest of the block put together, felt the cold come into her bones and sit down. That night she sat alone in her kitchen, under the doorframe with all its pencil marks, in the house she had filled with children for 50 years, and the doubt she had held off since Walter Pearson's funeral finally got its hand on her. The children were coming, yes, but what could even 100 children do against a bank, and a developer, and a stack of stamped and notarized paper that said, in the cold language the world actually listens to, that this house was no longer hers? Maybe the man was right. Maybe her time really was up. Maybe 50 years of love was simply no match for one well-built machine. She put her hand flat on the doorframe, on the lowest, oldest pencil mark, the one you had to crouch to read, and she sat there in the dark a long while, and then she did the only thing she had ever known how to do when the dark got heavy. She got up, and she put a pot on the stove, because her children were driving through the night to get to her, and her children, whatever else had changed, were going to be hungry when they arrived. What none of them knew yet, not Carl, not Miss Ruthie, not even Andre with his legal pad, was that the very paper Carl was so sure of, the airtight mortgage that made the law his, had one fatal crack running straight through the middle of it. And a lawyer who had once been a furious 9-year-old at that kitchen table was about to find it. Andre got there first, late that same night, before any of the others. And at first, what he found nearly broke his nerve. He sat at Miss Ruthie's kitchen table, the same table where she had made him do his homework 25 years before, with the eviction file spread out under the kitchen light, and he read it the way only a man who does this for a living can read it, and his heart sank, because it was bad. It was worse than Miss Ruthie knew. The notice was not a bluff. There was a real mortgage recorded against the house, a mortgage on a home she had owned free and clear for decades. There was a refinancing agreement, dated 3 years back, bearing her signature, that had quietly converted her paid-off house into collateral for a loan. The loan had gone into default. The bank had moved to foreclose. The foreclosed paper had been bought, through 2 shell companies, by an entity that traced, Andre followed it line by line, straight back to Carl Brandt. On paper, it was airtight. On cold, stamped, notarized paper, Ruth Mae Jackson had borrowed against her house and failed to pay, and the bank had every legal right to take it, and Carl Brandt had every legal right to buy it, and there was a lockout notice on the door that a judge would very likely uphold. Andre read it 3 times, and each time the same sick understanding settled deeper, that the machine which had eaten the Pearsons had been built to be exactly this hard to fight, and that they were running out of days. He looked up at her, finally, across the table. She had set a plate in front of him without asking. She always fed him before any hard conversation. That had not changed in 25 years, and he had not touched it. "Miss Ruthie," he said, keeping his voice even, the way she'd taught him, "I have to ask you something, and I need you to think back carefully. 3 years ago. Did you ever go down to the bank and sign something? Take out a loan against the house? Refinance? Anything at all?" And Miss Ruthie, who was 78 but whose mind was as clear as the day he'd met her, frowned and set down her own fork. 3 years ago, she repeated slowly, turning it over. "Baby, 3 years ago this past March, I was flat on my back in the hospital. I had my hip done, the left one, And then I was up in that rehabilitation place out on Cardinal Road the better part of 6 weeks, learning to walk again with the little frame, fussing the whole time. I couldn't hardly get myself to the bathroom 3 years ago, let alone down to any bank. She shook her head. I didn't sign nothing at no bank that spring. Why? What's that paper claiming I put my name on? Andre went very still. He looked down at the refinancing agreement in his hands, at the date printed across the top of it, and then he read that date again, and a third time, to be absolutely sure he was not letting hope make him careless. The agreement was dated squarely inside the 6 weeks Miss Ruthie had just described, the 6 weeks she had been 2 miles away at a rehabilitation facility on Cardinal Road, recovering from hip replacement surgery. A stretch of time that would be documented in hospital records, in surgical records, in rehab billing, in insurance claims, in a dozen separate places that all said the same thing in ink that nobody could argue with. That on the day this document claims Ruth Mae Jackson walked into a bank and signed away her house, Ruth Mae Jackson could not walk. The cold, still focused thing came up in Andre's chest. But this time, it was bright, almost joyful, the feeling of a hunter who has spent 10 years chasing exactly this animal and has just heard the trap close. "Miss Ruthie," he said, and for the first time since he'd walked through her door that night, he smiled. "The signature on this paper is a forgery." She stared at him. "A what?" "Somebody forged your name," he said, "on a notarized financial document, to put a fake mortgage on your house so the bank could foreclose on a loan you never took, so Carl Brandt could buy the paper and put you out. They counted on you being old and alone and unable to prove where you were 3 years ago." He laid the agreement flat on the table between them and put his finger on the date. "But you can prove it, to the day, because you were in a hospital bed having your hip replaced, and there are records. And Miss Ruthie," he leaned forward, "a forged signature isn't just bad paper. It isn't a thing you fight about in housing court and maybe lose. It's a crime, a serious one, and it doesn't belong to just whoever held the pen. It runs uphill, to the notary who stamped it, to the bank that processed it, all the way up to the man who paid to have it done, if we can prove the chain. And I think we can prove the chain." For a long moment, Miss Ruthie did not say anything. She looked at the paper, and then at the doorframe across the kitchen, and then back at the boy she had raised, the furious 9-year-old who had grown into the man now sitting at her table, telling her the wolf had made a mistake. "So," she said finally, quietly, "it's not just my house we can save." "No, ma'am," Andre said. "I don't think we're just going to save your house." He gathered the papers together. "I think we're going to bury the man who tried to take it. But I need 2 things from you. I need your hospital records from 3 years ago, all of them. And I need that tin box from the closet, the one with everybody's names and numbers in the lid." He stood up. "Because tomorrow morning, when Carl Brandt comes back here with his lockout crew, he is not going to find one old woman alone on a porch. And he is going to learn, in front of everybody, exactly what kind of paper he built his whole scheme on." And outside, in the dark, the first of the other cars was already turning onto the block. It began the next morning, and it began with Andre's car still parked at the curb where it had sat all night. But this time, Andre did not hurry inside. He got out, and he leaned against the car, and he waited. Because he had spent the night on the phone, and he knew what was about to come up that empty street. The next car was Marcus's. Dr. Marcus Bell got out in the scrubs he hadn't bothered to change out of, having driven straight from a double shift. And he walked up and stood beside Andre, and the 2 men, the doctor and the lawyer, who had been 2 hungry boys at the same kitchen table 30 years before, shook hands without a word and turned together to watch the street. Then came Tanya. Detective Hughes parked her unmarked car deliberately, nose to tail, right behind the spot where Carl's black SUV had sat the day before, and got out with her badge clipped to her belt and joined them. Then Greg Carter's work truck rumbled up. Carter Construction and Inspection lettered on the door, and Greg climbed out with a hard hat under one arm and a clipboard in his hand and a city inspector's credential clipped to his vest, already looking up at the roof lines with a professional frown. And then came the rest. They came in ones and twos, and then in a steady stream, cars filling the dead block, parking in front of the plywood houses where no one had parked in months, doors opening up and down the silent street. A nurse in scrubs, a teacher who had left her class with a substitute, a pastor in his collar, a woman in a sharp suit who ran the city's biggest community foundation, a councilman's chief of staff, men and women in their 30s and 40s and 50s, most of them black, a few not, dressed for the jobs they had walked out of, every single one of them wearing the same expression, the look of a grown person who has just learned that the one adult who saved them when they were small is in trouble, and who has dropped everything on this earth to come and stand on her porch. They did not shout. They did not make a scene. They simply arrived and gathered and stayed, filling the porch, filling the little yard, spilling out onto the cracked sidewalk and into the street. Some of them went up and hugged Miss Ruthie, who had come out in her house dress and stood at the top of her own steps, with her hand pressed to her mouth, because she had known they would come, and still was not prepared for the sight of all of them, all at once, grown and accomplished, and here. Some of them she had not seen in years. Some of them she had measured against her doorframe when they were small enough to carry. Now they made a wall in front of her house, dozens deep, and the dead block had more life on it than it had held since the lights started going out. By the time Carl Brandt's SUV rolled up that morning, Carl in the passenger seat scrolling his phone, the lockout crew and a locksmith following in a second vehicle, Kevin Daly trailing nervously behind in his sedan, there were 40 people standing in front of Miss Ruthie's little soft blue house. 40. Carl got out and stopped. He looked at the crowd. He looked at the doctor in his scrubs, and the detective with the badge on her hip, and the inspector with the clipboard, and the lawyer leaning against the car with his arms folded, and the dozens of others, ordinary and unhurried and utterly immovable, standing between him and the door. And the easy confidence that had carried him up these steps the day before flickered out of his face, the way a predator's certainty flickers the instant it realizes the cornered thing was never actually alone. "What is this?" Carl said. It wasn't really a question. The locksmith behind him had already, quietly, stopped getting his tools out of the van. Nobody answered. The crowd just looked at him. "I asked what this is," Carl said again, louder, reaching for the old bluster and not quite finding it. "This is private property and a legal proceeding. You people need to clear off the premises. We have a lawful lockout scheduled for this address this morning, and anyone interfering is going to be." He stopped because the screen door had opened behind the crowd, and Miss Ruthie had come out onto the top of her steps, small and straight in her house dress, and every head on that porch had turned toward her, the way a field of flowers turns toward the sun. She looked down at Carl Brandt over the heads of all her children, and she did not say anything at all. She just looked at him with that almost gentle expression and waited, because she had told him, the day before, to have a little patience that her company was about to arrive, and now it had. It was Andre who pushed off from the car. He walked, unhurried, through the parting crowd to the bottom of the steps, and he turned to face the developer, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet and it carried all the way down the dead street. "You asked who we are," Andre said. "All right, let me tell you exactly who we are." "That man right there," Andre said, nodding toward the figure in scrubs, "is Dr. Marcus Bell. He runs the emergency department at Mercy and a free clinic on the east side. Last year, he treated about 9,000 people who had nowhere else to go." He nodded to the woman with the badge. "That's Detective Tanya Hughes, homicide. The one behind her with the clipboard is Greg Carter, licensed building contractor and a city inspector. That's a nurse. That's a school teacher. That's the director of the Holloway Community Foundation, which I think has given grants to about half the good things in this part of town. There's a pastor. There's a chief of staff at City Hall. And me, I'm a lawyer, housing law mostly. I've spent 10 years suing men exactly like you." Carl Brandt's eyes moved across the crowd, and you could see him doing a kind of arithmetic he had never had to do before, and not liking the answer. "And here's the part you're going to want to hear," Andre went on, and now his voice dropped, and somehow that made everyone lean in. Every single one of us, the doctor, the detective, the inspector, the teacher, the nurse, all 40 of us standing here, and a couple hundred more who couldn't get here this morning but are on their phones right now. Every one of us was a hungry kid that this woman fed at her own kitchen table. Some of us slept on her couch when home wasn't safe. Some of us got walked back home by the ear when we were heading the wrong way. All of us got told by her, when we were small and scared and nobody else on this earth believed it, that we were going to be somebody. He took one step up. "You stood on this porch yesterday, in front of God and everybody, and you called her a nobody. You told her nobody knows her name." He let it hang. "Mister, you have no idea whose porch you're standing on. She is the reason every one of us exists. We are her children, all of us, and you came here to throw our mother out into the street." For a moment, Carl Brandt said nothing, because there was nothing to say. He had spent 2 years perfecting a method that depended entirely on its targets being isolated: the lone widow, the couple with no one, the old man whose kids had moved away. He had looked at Ruth Mae Jackson's county records and seen no husband, no children, no heirs, and concluded she was the most alone of all of them, the easiest mark on the whole street. And he was now standing in front of the largest, most formidable, most quietly furious family he had ever seen, assembled in one place. And every face in it was looking at him the way you look at a man who has just raised his hand to your mother. "I don't," Carl started, and stopped. He tried again, reaching for the voice that had always worked, the smooth one. "This is very moving. It is, but it doesn't change the legal facts. The bank holds the note. The foreclosure is valid. I bought this property fair and square, and sentiment doesn't." "Funny you should mention the bank," said Greg Carter, and he said it in the flat, bored, unbothered voice of a man holding a clipboard and a great deal of municipal authority. He flipped a page. "Because while I was waiting around this morning, I went ahead and pulled the permit history on your project. The whole block. And, Mr. Brandt, I've got to tell you, there is some genuinely fascinating reading in here. Demolition permits filed before the sales even closed. Asbestos surveys that look an awful lot like the same document copy-pasted across 6 different addresses with the numbers changed. And a real interesting pattern of liens that seem to pop up on properties about 10 minutes before you buy them cheap." He looked up and smiled without any warmth at all. "The city is going to want to take a long, slow look at how you acquired this entire street. I'd imagine a lot of people are going to want to look. Reporters, for instance." Kevin Daly, standing at the edge of it all with his leather folder, had gone the color of paper. And then Andre reached into his jacket and took out a single sheet, and beside it, a thick envelope of documents, and held them up where everyone, including Carl, could see. "And this," he said, "is the mortgage your bank says gives you the right to take this house. Signed by Ruth Mae Jackson, dated 3 years ago this past March." He paused, letting it land. "There's just one problem with it. 3 years ago this past March," Andre said, "the day this document claims Miss Ruthie walked into a bank and signed her house away. She was in a hospital bed 2 miles from here, recovering from a hip replacement. And after that she was 6 weeks in a rehabilitation facility out on Cardinal Road, learning to walk again with a frame." He lifted the thick envelope. "I've got the surgical records, the rehab records, the insurance claims, the billing, all of it, dated, signed by doctors, stamped by the hospital. On the day she supposedly signed this mortgage, Ruth Mae Jackson could not get herself to the bathroom without help. She never set foot in that bank." He turned the single sheet around so the crowd could see the signature on it, which means somebody forged an old woman's name, notarized it, ran it through a bank, and used it to manufacture a foreclosure so a developer could buy her house out from under her. He looked straight at Carl. "That's not a real estate dispute anymore, Mr. Brandt. That's forgery. That's fraud. That's a whole stack of felonies. And forged paper doesn't just lose you a house, it runs uphill to whoever signed it, to the notary who stamped it, to the bank that processed it. His eyes flicked deliberately to Kevin Daly, to whoever ordered it done. Kevin Daly took a step backward off the porch because Kevin Daly had personally processed that document, and Kevin Daly had just understood all at once exactly where this was going to land, and that I was only following the policy was not going to be anywhere near enough. Detective Tanya Hughes had taken a small notebook out of her jacket. She did not say anything dramatic. She just opened it and clicked her pen and looked at Kevin Daly and then at Carl Brandt with the patient, unhurried attention of a homicide detective who has all day. And that quiet click of a pen did more to drain the color out of Carl Brandt's face than any shouting could have. Now, before Miss Ruthie says the thing she is about to say, the thing that turns this whole morning from a legal victory into something none of these people will ever forget, I need you to do something for me. If you have ever in your life been the nobody somebody decided they could push around, if somebody ever looked at you and saw only what they could take, and if there was someone who stood up for you when it counted, type their name in the comments right now. Hit that like button so this story reaches the next person who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you haven't. And let's go inside that house, because Miss Ruthie is about to show Carl Brandt exactly what she spent 50 years building. Because Miss Ruthie raised one hand, just lifted it a little, from the top of her steps, and 40 people went quiet. And even Carl Brandt went quiet, out of some old animal reflex that recognizes the gesture of a woman who has quieted 10,000 kitchens. Carl Brandt, she said. She said his whole name the way she used to say the names of children who had disappointed her. And 3 or 4 grown men in that crowd straightened their spines out of pure muscle memory. You came up on my porch yesterday and you told me I'm nobody, that nobody on this block even knows my name, that I never built a thing worth keeping. She nodded slowly, as if considering it fairly. Come here, I want to show you something. All of you who never got to see it, come on inside. There's room. And she turned, and she opened her screen door, and she held it, and she beckoned. And Carl Brandt, who could not for the life of him have explained why he was obeying a 78-year-old woman in slippers, found his feet carrying him up the steps and through that door, with the whole crowd pressing in warm and silent behind him, back through the little house, into the kitchen that had been the warmest room on the block for 50 years. And Miss Ruthie pointed at the doorframe. Read it, she said. Carl Brandt looked at the doorframe. For a moment he didn't understand what he was seeing, just an old painted doorframe, the paint worn down to bare wood, covered in pencil marks. And then his eyes adjusted, the way the viewers would, and he saw the marks for what they were. Dozens and dozens of pencil lines, climbing the wood from knee height to well over 6 feet. And beside each line, in a careful hand, a name and a date. Marcus, age 7. Andre, age 9. Tanya, age 6. Little Greg, age 10. Names he had never heard. Names stacked one above the other, the same name climbing year after year, a whole childhood measured in pencil on a kitchen door. And behind him, the crowd that had pressed into that little kitchen began, one by one, to find themselves on the wall. Marcus reached out and put 2 fingers on Marcus, age 7, and could not speak. Tanya found Tanya, age 6, and then Tanya, age 7, and Tanya, age 8, a whole stack of her own childhood climbing the frame, and pressed her hand flat over her mouth. Greg, 50 years old, a man who built skyscrapers, found little Greg, age 10, and made a sound he had not made since he was a boy. Grown men and women, doctors and lawyers and police officers, crowded around a battered doorframe in a condemned house and wept, openly, without shame, because there it was. The proof, in pencil, that they had once been small and frightened, and that one person on this earth had stood them against a wall and measured them and written down that they existed, that somebody was keeping track, that they were going to be somebody. Every one of these, Miss Ruthie said quietly into the silence, is a child somebody else had already given up on. I wrote down every single one. Not their height, baby. Anybody can measure a child's height. She touched the lowest mark, the oldest one, the one you had to crouch to read. I wrote down that they were here, that somebody saw them, that somebody was keeping count of them when the rest of the world had stopped counting. Then she went to the closet off the back hall and came back with the dented tin box, and she set it on the kitchen table and opened the lid, and she let them look. The letters, the graduation programs, the wedding invitations, the birth announcements of babies belonging to babies she had once measured. The newspaper clippings, folded soft. Local doctor opens free clinic, with a name and an age penciled on the back. 50 years of an archive she had never called an archive. The whole record of what one woman with no money and no name and no children of her own had built out of a warm kitchen and the refusal to look away from a cold child on a porch. "You stood out there," Miss Ruthie said, turning at last to face Carl Brandt directly. And there was no hatred in her voice, only a terrible level patience. "And you told me I built nothing, that my time is up, that I'm a nobody in a house that isn't mine." She gestured slowly around the crowded little kitchen, at the doctor and the detective and the inspector and the lawyer and the nurse and the teacher and the pastor, all of them weeping at her doorframe. "You build buildings, son. I understand that's real work, and I don't mock it. But I have spent 50 years in this kitchen building people. Every one of these grown men and women crying at my door. That's what I built, and it doesn't come down. You can't bulldoze it. You can't foreclose on it. You can't put a piece of plywood over it." She held his eyes. "Now, you look at this room, and you tell me to my face, does this look like nobody to you?" Carl Brandt did not answer. There was no answer to give. He stood in the warmest room on a dead block, surrounded by the living, breathing, weeping proof of everything he had spent his whole successful life failing to understand, that the only thing a person ever really builds is other people, and that it is the one thing on earth that cannot be taken with a stack of paper. For the first time in his ruthless, profitable life, Carl Brandt looked at something he could not buy, could not move, and could not knock down, and he had absolutely nothing to say. And in the doorway behind him, Detective Hughes quietly clicked her pen again, because it was time, now, to talk about the paper. What happened after that happened the way these things happen, once the truth is finally standing in the room with you, quickly and then all at once. The forged mortgage was the loose thread, and once Andre put it in Detective Hughes's hands, she did not have to invent a case. She just had to pull. The notary whose stamp sat on Miss Ruthie's forged signature turned out to have stamped a remarkable number of suspicious documents on properties up and down that block. And when investigators came knocking, the notary did exactly what frightened accomplices always do when the word prison is spoken out loud across a table. He started talking fast, naming names to save himself. The thread ran straight up through Kevin Daly's bank, through the two shell companies, into the heart of Carl Brandt's operation. And what it revealed was that what had been done to Miss Ruthie had been done, in one flavor or another, to half the street. The sudden liens, the manufactured defaults, the forged and pressured paper. The Pearsons had not lost their home to bad luck or a soft market. They had lost it to a machine, and the machine had a name, and the name was Carl Brandt. And then Andre did the thing Carl Brandt feared more than any lawsuit. He made it a story. He brought in the press, and the press could not have asked for a better one. The developer who tried to bulldoze the woman who raised half the city, and the 40 doctors and lawyers and police who showed up on her porch to stop him. The photograph that ran on the front page, and then everywhere, was of Miss Ruthie at the top of her own steps, surrounded by her grown children, the soft blue house behind her, and the door frame just visible through the open door. The headline practically wrote itself. Within a week, the city had launched the formal investigation Greg had promised into the permits, the liens, the whole pattern of how an entire block had been emptied. The eviction was not merely halted, It was thrown out entirely. The forged mortgage was declared void, and Ruth Mae Jackson's clear, unencumbered title to her home, the home she had owned outright for decades, was restored with an apology from a judge who had read the hospital records and did not bother to hide his disgust. And then the questions kept coming about every house on that block, about every lonely old owner Carl Brandt had squeezed out. And the answers were ugly enough that the entire empire of revitalization came apart at the seams. Carl Brandt was charged. So was Kevin Daly, who discovered far too late that "I was only following the policy" is not a defense that survives contact with a forged signature on a notarized document. The convictions took longer than the headlines, the way they always do, but they came. Carl's investors fled. His financing collapsed. The bulldozers he had scheduled for spring never turned a single shovel of that street. And the man who measured his whole worth in cleared lots and closed deals watched all of it slip through his manicured fingers, undone by one old woman he had been arrogant enough to call a nobody. But the part Miss Ruthie actually cared about was not the charges. It was the houses. Because the same investigation that buried Carl Brandt also began, slowly, to undo what he had done. The fraudulent sales were unwound one by one, and several of the families he had pushed off that block were given the chance to come home. Among them was Loretta Pearson. Her sale, built like the rest, on pressure and manufactured liens, was reversed, and Loretta moved back into the house where she had raised her children and buried one of them, 4 doors down from Miss Ruthie. Too late for Walter, but not too late for her. She would live there many more years among neighbors who knew her name, and when her own time finally came, she died at home, in her own bed, with Miss Ruthie sitting beside her, holding her hand. "You came back," Miss Ruthie told her near the end. "That's the whole thing, Loretta. They tried to scatter us, and you came back. It was the only revenge either of them ever wanted, and it was complete. The block was saved. Not as a developer's rendering, not as luxury units with a coffee bar, saved as itself, as a living street. The lights coming back on in the windows one by one where they had gone dark. And at the center of it, on the corner, the soft blue house with the porch swing still stood, swept clean every morning by a woman whose time, it turned out, was nowhere near up. But the deepest thing that happened was not in any courtroom, and it did not make the front page. It happened in that kitchen in the days and weeks after, when Miss Ruthie's children simply would not leave. It started as taking turns. She had had a hard scare, and they were not ready, any of them, to let her be alone in that house at night, so they made a quiet schedule among themselves. Somebody there every evening, sleeping on the couch that a dozen of them had slept on as frightened kids. And then it became something more than a schedule. Marcus took over her medical care, properly finally, the way she had once taken over his when he was a sick and frightened 7-year-old, got her to the specialists she'd been putting off, sat with her in the waiting rooms, fussed at her about her blood pressure until she laughed and called him bossy. Greg went through the whole house with his contractor's eye and fixed every single thing that 50 years of giving everything away had left broken. The sagging porch step, the wiring that should have scared somebody decades ago, the roof. He would not take a dime, and when she tried to argue, he said, "Miss Ruthie, you measured me against that door frame when I was throwing rocks at streetlights. You don't get to fight with me about a roof." Tanya organized something half official and half not, a quiet watch over the block, so that no developer ever again would find the old people on that street easy to pick off alone. And Andre did the thing that mattered most for the long run. He put the house, and eventually the whole block's protection, into an ironclad legal trust so that no paper trick, no forged signature, no machine could ever come for it again. He sat at the kitchen table where he had done his homework and drew it up himself, and when he was done, he slid it across to her and said, "Nobody takes this house from you. Not while you're here, and not after. I made sure. It's the least I could do for the woman who taught me what the law was actually for." And here's the thing about Miss Ruthie, the thing that tells you who she was all the way down. Surrounded now by her grown children, safe, her home restored, the man who had called her nobody facing prison, she did not rest, and she did not gloat. She looked around her crowded little kitchen at all of them, the doctors and the lawyers and the police, and what she felt mostly was a kind of astonishment, because she had never once in 50 years added it up. She had only ever seen one cold child at a time on one porch at a time. She had never stood back and seen the whole of it, the way you cannot see a forest when you are the one planting the trees, one seed at a time, over half a century, never expecting to live long enough to stand in the shade. "I didn't know," she said to Andre one evening, looking around the full kitchen, her voice gone soft and wondering. "All these years, baby, I swear I didn't know there were so many of you. I just kept setting another plate." She shook her head slowly. "You feed one hungry child. You don't think you're doing anything. You're just feeding a child. You don't ever think you're building." She gestured around the room, at all of them, at the doorframe, at 50 years. "You don't ever think you're building this." "You were, Miss Ruthie," Marcus said quietly from across the table. "The whole time. You just never stopped to look at it." And for the first time in her long life, Ruth Mae Jackson stopped and looked at it and let herself see what she had made. When the dust settled, Miss Ruthie's children came to her with an idea, and at first she fought it because the idea had her name on it. The foundation director, one of her own, a woman who had eaten at that table 30 years before, had found the money, and Andre had drawn up the papers, and Greg had found the building, one of Carl Brandt's emptied houses, 2 doors down, brought back from plywood and ruin. They wanted to make it a place, and they wanted to call it the Ruth Mae Jackson Center. And Miss Ruthie said, "Absolutely not. You will not put my name on a building. I never did any of it for that." And they let her fuss, and then they did it anyway, because for once in their lives, they outvoted her, 40-1. The center did the 2 things she had done her whole life, the only 2 things she had ever known how to do. It was a place for the neighborhood's children to come after school, to be fed a hot meal, to get help with their homework at long tables, to be looked at by an adult who had time for them. There was a brand new door frame just inside the door, and a rule that every child got measured on their first day, and a book balanced flat on the head, and somebody telling them every single time the old sentence, "You are going to be somebody." The volunteers who staffed it were, more often than not, her own grown children, giving back a few hours a week, a doctor running a Saturday clinic, a lawyer doing a free legal hour, a detective coaching the kids' basketball, a teacher tutoring the ones who'd fallen behind. And the other half of the center was a housing and legal aid office run on Andre's time, and a rotating crew of others that did for every threatened old homeowner in that part of the city exactly what 40 people had done for Miss Ruthie. When the letters came, the sudden liens, the mysterious defaults, the helpful man with the lowball offer, the old people of that neighborhood no longer faced the machine alone in the dark, the way Walter and Loretta Pearson had. Now they had a number to call. Now somebody showed up and read the paper, and would not let them be taken without a fight. The thing that had killed Walter Pearson, being alone with it, was the one thing the center existed to make impossible. Years went by. This is the part of the story that happens quietly, in the way the best parts always do. Miss Ruthie lived a long time, yet long enough to see the center fill with a whole new generation of children, long enough to measure some of their grandchildren against that new door frame, long enough to become, formally and on the record and in the newspaper, exactly what she had always been informally, the mother of half the city. The developers learned to go around that block. The lights stayed on. The street that was supposed to be a vacant lot by spring was, instead, more alive than it had been in 30 years, because one old woman had refused to be the last light going out, and her children had come home to make sure she never would be. On her 90th birthday, they closed the block to traffic and threw a party, and hundreds of people came, her children and her children's children, and the children from the center, and neighbors, and the mayor, and 3 news cameras. And Miss Ruthie sat on her own front porch, on the porch swing that had held 1,000 crying teenagers. On the porch a man had once stood on and told her that her time was up. And she watched a living, laughing, crowded street that was supposed to be rubble. And she found Andre in the crowd and reached out and took his hand. "He told me I didn't have anything," she said, looking out at all of them. "Because I never had money, and I never had a name anybody important knew, and I never had a child of my own." She smiled and squeezed his hand, her grip still surprisingly strong. "And the whole time, baby, I was the richest woman on this block. I just kept my fortune somewhere they couldn't get at it." She nodded out at the crowd, at all of them, at 50 years come home. "I kept it in people. So, let me ask you something before you go. What do you think we actually build with our lives? Carl Brandt built buildings. He believed that was the only kind of building that counted. The kind with a deed and a price and a permit. The kind you can buy and sell and knock down on a schedule. And he looked at a woman who had built nothing he could see. No fortune, no monument, no name in any paper that mattered to him. And he decided she was nobody. That her time had passed. That she could be swept off her own porch like a dead leaf. He was so certain of it that he said it to her face. And he could not possibly have been more wrong, because Ruth Mae Jackson had spent 50 years building the one thing in this world that actually lasts. She built people. And it turns out you cannot evict a woman who built people, because every last one of them will get in the car and come stand on her porch. Here is the thing I want you to sit with tonight. The world is full of Carl Brandts, people who measure a human being's worth by what they own, and what title they carry, and whether the important people know their name. And the world is just as full of Miss Ruthies, quiet people in small houses who never had a dime and never made the news, who spent their whole lives pouring love into children or neighbors or strangers, expecting absolutely nothing back. And we are so quicker than we would ever like to admit, to look at the Miss Ruthies and see exactly what Carl saw. A nobody. Somebody whose time has passed. Somebody it is safe to overlook. And we are wrong every single time. Most of the time we never even find out how wrong, because most Miss Ruthies never get 40 grown children showing up on the porch to prove it. So this is what her life asks of you, and it asks 2 things. The first is this. Somewhere in your past, there is almost certainly a Miss Ruthie. Somebody who fed you when you were hungry in a way that had nothing to do with food. Somebody who looked at you when you were small and scared and overlooked, and told you that you were going to be somebody before there was one shred of evidence that it was true. If that person is still living, I am asking you, do not wait for the porch. Do not wait until it is a crisis or a hospital room or a funeral. Call them this week, say their name out loud, and tell them what they built when they were quietly, patiently building you. Most of these people go their whole lives never knowing the size of what they made, because, like Miss Ruthie, they only ever saw one cold child at a time. Be the one who tells them. And the second thing is harder. Go be a Miss Ruthie. You do not need money to do it, and you do not need a title, and you do not need a single important person to know your name. You just need to open a door, learn somebody's name, notice the kid the world has already decided about, the one nobody's keeping count of, and keep count of them. Tell them you see them and that they are going to be somebody, and then mean it and show up again and again, the way she did, for years, for free, expecting nothing. That is the whole secret. That is the only thing she ever did. And it built something that no developer on earth, with all the money and all the paper and all the bulldozers in the world, could ever knock down. If this story moved you, tell me in the comments about the person who built you, the one who kept count of you when no one else did, and then go and tell them out loud while you still can. Hit that like button so more people find this story, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell so you never miss the next one. Because in the end, the man with all the buildings lost every last thing he had, and the woman they called nobody turned out to own the only thing in this world worth owning. She kept it in people, and when her time came, The time a stranger once told her was already up. Half the city stood up to prove that it wasn't, and never had been. Take care of each other. Go build somebody. And I'll see you in the next story.